April 4th, 1945. The Allied armies moved deep into the heart of Germany. The spring sun was warm. Trees across the countryside were in full bloom. It looked like a peaceful landscape. But as the jeeps of the United States 4th Armored Division turned onto a country road near Gotha, the atmosphere shifted. The soldiers hit a wall. It was not a physical barrier. It was a wall of smell. The air turned heavy and thick. Men began to gag. Some vomited over the sides of their vehicles. It was the scent of rotting meat mixed with the stench of burning hair. General George S. Patton sat in his command car. He caught the scent and covered his nose. Patton assumed they had stumbled upon a chemical plant or a factory processing dead horses. He summoned his staff officers immediately. He ordered them to find the source of the odor. 3 hours passed. A jeep returned to the command post at high speed. The officer inside was visibly trembling. His skin was pale. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. He stood before Patton and delivered his report. The officer told him he had to see the site for himself. He said it was unbelievable. Patton drove to the location. The site was called Ohrdruf. This was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by the United States Army on the Western Front. At first glance, it looked like a labor camp, but in reality, it was a factory of death. Patton entered the gates. The footage from that day shows the general's face turning grim. He was a man nicknamed Old Blood and Guts. He was a veteran of the most brutal battles in history. He had seen thousands of corpses on the front lines. But Ohrdruf was different. The sight of the piles of bodies changed him. Patton walked through the barracks. He saw the skeletal survivors. He saw the lime pits and the makeshift gallows. The man who loved the glory of war suddenly felt the weight of its horrors. Patton walked behind a shed. There, the legendary general physically collapsed and vomited. The war was almost over. But for the soldiers who entered Ohrdruf, the nightmare was only beginning. The world would soon see the truth. The general vomited. Physical sickness passed quickly, replaced by a cold and calculated rage. Patton did not just want to liberate the prisoners, he wanted a reckoning. He looked toward the nearby town. It was clean and orderly. He saw German civilians peering through lace curtains, pretending the smell of burning flesh did not exist. He gave an order that changed the rules of the occupation. Round them up, every single one. Bring the mayor and his wife. Bring the baker and the butcher. If they claimed ignorance, he would provide an education. This is the story of the liberation of Ohrdruf. It was the day George Patton forced an entire German town to walk through hell at gunpoint. It ended with a shocking suicide that no one saw coming. To understand the rage, the details must be seen. Ohrdruf was not a massive factory of death like Auschwitz. It was a sub-camp of Buchenwald. But the scale did not matter. The footage shows a landscape of pure horror. When the tanks of the 4th Armored Division reached the barbed wire, the SS guards were gone. They had fled hours earlier, but they did not leave quietly. Before retreating, the guards attempted to erase the evidence of their crimes. They used machine guns on prisoners who were too weak to walk. They stacked the corpses in sheds like firewood. They poured quicklime over the bodies to dissolve the skin and bone. They ran out of time. The Americans entered the gates. They did not find a cheering crowd. They found walking skeletons. These were men in striped uniforms weighing 60 or 70 pounds. Their eyes were deep in their skulls. The prisoners did not shout or celebrate. They lacked the physical strength for joy. Instead, they reached out and touched the metal of the American tanks. They wept quietly, running their fingers over the white stars painted on the armor. They needed to know if the steel was real. General Walton Walker was one of the toughest men in the Army. He saw the camp and immediately picked up the radio. He called Patton. "General, you must come here immediately." Patton arrived shortly after. He did not come alone. He brought General Omar Bradley and the Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. They walked through the gates together. The smell was the first thing to hit them. It was a thick, sweet rot that stuck to their uniforms. Patton walked past a pile of 40 bodies. They were stacked in a small shed, covered in lime. Eisenhower grew pale. Bradley looked at the ground. Patton stayed silent. He was looking at the town on the horizon. The people there were eating lunch. They were going about their day. Patton turned to his officers and gave the command. He wanted every civilian in that town to see what was behind the fence. At first glance, it was a routine inspection, but in reality, it was a forced confrontation with death. Events accelerated. Soldiers entered the town of Ohrdruf. They went door to door. They did not ask for volunteers. They ordered the citizens into the streets. 2,000 people were marched toward the camp gates. They wore their Sunday clothes. They looked confused. They looked indignant. That changed the moment they crossed the perimeter. The sound of boots on gravel stopped. The townspeople stood in front of the pits. Some covered their eyes. Others fainted. Patton watched them. He did not allow them to look away. He made the mayor stand inches from the bodies. The mayor's wife began to shake. Patton's face remained a mask of stone. He wanted the trauma to be permanent. He wanted the denial to end. But the psychological weight was too much for some. That night, the mayor and his wife went home. They did not sleep. They did not discuss the future. They took a rope and ended their lives together in their living room. A note was found, but it changed nothing. The message was already sent. The world now knew what had happened behind the wire. Thus ended the first day of the American realization. The war was no longer just about maps and territory. It was about the things they found in the sheds. April 12, 1945. 3 of the most powerful men in the United States Army arrived at the gates of Ohrdruf. General Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George S. Patton. They had commanded millions of soldiers. They had authorized massive bombardments and seen thousands die in battle. They considered themselves hardened by years of war. They were wrong. Patton walked through the entrance first. The footage from that day captures him: a polished helmet, his signature ivory-handled revolvers, and a riding crop in his hand. He looked like a conqueror entering a defeated city, but as he moved deeper into the camp, his physical posture shifted. The swagger disappeared. The generals reached the Appellplatz. This was the roll call square. In the center, the reality of the Holocaust was visible. Bodies were stacked in piles like cordwood, 20, 30, 40 at a time. The corpses were naked and skeletal. Most had a single bullet hole in the back of the neck. Patton walked to the edge of a pile. He stopped and stared. Why did the world's toughest general freeze? He was looking at industrial-scale murder. Suddenly, a survivor moved. A man who was little more than a skeleton crawled through the dirt toward Patton. He reached out to kiss the general's boots. Patton did not pull away in disgust. He stepped back gently and reached down. He helped the man stand up. For the first time, his aide saw moisture in his eyes. Then, the group moved to the torture shed. The smell of decay was thick. Inside, the equipment was still in place. There was a heavy whipping block. The wood was no longer its original color. It was stained a deep, dark crimson from years of absorbed blood. On the walls, iron hooks hung from the ceiling. At first glance, it looked like a warehouse, but in reality, it was a killing room. The camp guide explained the process. He was a prisoner who spoke English. He pointed to the hooks where men were hung by their necks to suffocate slowly. He described how SS guards beat prisoners to death for entertainment. The reaction was immediate. Eisenhower's face turned white. He stood perfectly still, like a marble statue. Bradley looked at the floor in total silence. He could not find words. Patton was different. He was vibrating with physical rage. He turned and walked to the back of the shed, away from the cameras. His aides watched from a distance. Patton's shoulders were heaving. The most aggressive general in the American military was physically sick to his stomach. When he finally returned to the group, his tone had shifted. He no longer sounded like a commander. He sounded like a prosecutor. He looked at a young American military policeman guarding the perimeter. He asked if the local German civilians knew what was happening inside these fences. The MP shook his head. They claimed they had no idea. They said they thought it was just a prison for common criminals. Patton did not argue. He only laughed. It was a dark, bitter sound that echoed off the wooden walls. The tour was over. The evidence was recorded. The era of ignorance had ended. April 4th, 1945. The smell of death covered the entire county. The local Germans claimed they didn't know, but the stench of the Ohrdruf concentration camp reached every house. General George Patton did not wait for orders from Eisenhower. He did not ask for permission from high command. He took charge immediately. Patton called the provost marshal. He summoned the chief of military police to his side. He raised his riding crop and pointed toward the town of Ohrdruf. It was a beautiful medieval German village. The streets were clean. Flower boxes hung from the windows. It sat only 2 miles away from a mountain of human corpses. Patton issued a direct order. The military police were to enter the town. They were to find the burgomaster, the mayor, and his wife. They were to round up every leading citizen, every banker, and every doctor. Every person of influence was to be brought to the camp. The officer asked a question. What if they refused to come? Patton touched the ivory handle of his Colt revolver. He told the officer they would not refuse. He ordered the use of trucks or bayonets if necessary. Every single citizen was going to tour the camp. This was a punishment not found in any military manual. It was forced witnessing. Patton wanted to shatter their denial. He wanted to rub their noses in the filth they had supported for years. He wanted the evidence to be undeniable. The next morning, the trucks arrived at the camp gates. The citizens of Ohrdruf climbed down from the transport vehicles. They were dressed in their Sunday best. The men wore suits and pressed ties. The women wore fine dresses and heavy coats. The footage shows their expressions. They looked annoyed. They looked offended by the interruption of their day. Some complained about the smell of the air. Others held silk handkerchiefs to their noses to block the scent of rot. They remained arrogant. They still acted like the master race. They demanded to know why they were being dragged to such a dirty, low place. Patton ordered the MPs to form a perimeter. He gave a simple command: march them through. Patton told the guards not to let the civilians look away. If they closed their eyes, the soldiers were to use rifle butts to force them open. He wanted them to see everything. The tour began. The civilians walked toward the first pile of bodies. Suddenly, the crowd stopped moving. The chatting stopped. The complaining died in their throats. There was no more talk of inconvenience. There was only the sound of the wind and the buzzing of thousands of flies. They stared at the emaciated corpses. The bodies looked like wooden sticks covered in thin parchment paper. The reality of the regime had finally arrived at their doorstep. There was no turning back. April 12, 1945. The tour of the Ohrdruf concentration camp began. Some civilians gasped at the sight of the stacked corpses. One woman collapsed onto the dirt. Military police did not stop to help. They pushed the crowd forward with their rifles. The command was simple: move. The soldiers led the townspeople to the whipping blocks and the massive ovens used for cremations. They forced the Germans to stand inches away from the bodies. They made them look directly into the open, clouded eyes of the dead. General George S. Patton stood nearby. He watched the civilians like a predator. He studied every flinch and every twitch of their faces. At first, the crowd showed only shock. Then, the shock turned into pure horror. But as the minutes passed, Patton saw the emotion he was looking for: guilt. Some men began to weep openly. Women became hysterical, screaming at the sight of the charcoal remains. Others simply stared at their shoes. They knew, they had always known. They had simply chosen to look away while the chimneys smoked. Patton walked directly to the mayor of Ohrdruf. The man was shaking uncontrollably. Patton leaned in and looked him in the eye. He asked if the mayor knew. The mayor did not speak. He only shook his head while tears ran down his cheeks. Patton turned back to his staff officers. He pointed at the weeping crowd. He stated that these were not members of a master race. He called them people who had lost their souls. The tour lasted for 2 hours. By the end, the citizens of Ohrdruf were physically and mentally broken. Their previous arrogance had vanished. Their expensive clothes were covered in the gray dust of the camp. The stench of decomposing flesh clung to their skin and hair. Guards loaded them back onto the transport trucks. No one spoke. The vehicles drove back to the town, passing clean houses with well-tended flower boxes. Patton felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He believed justice had been served. That night, Patton sat at his desk. He wrote a letter to his wife. He described his white-hot anger. He wrote that he had taught the townspeople a lesson they would never forget. But for some, the lesson was too heavy to carry. The mayor and his wife returned to their home. They sat in their living room. Perhaps they discussed the piles of bodies. Perhaps they sat in total silence. No record exists of their final conversation, but their final actions are documented. The next morning, American soldiers arrived at the mayor's residence. They had administrative orders to deliver. They knocked on the heavy wooden door. There was no sound from inside. They knocked again, louder this time. Silence. The soldiers kicked the door off its hinges and entered. The footage would show a quiet house. In the living room, they found the mayor and his wife. Both were dead. They had used blades to slit their own wrists. A short note lay on the table next to the bodies. It was written in German. It contained one main sentence: "We cannot live with this shame." The report reached Patton shortly after. He showed no pity. He did not offer a moment of silence. He simply nodded. He remarked that there were now 2 fewer Nazis for the army to feed. It was a cold response, but Patton had already seen the pits filled with the innocent. To him, the debt was simply being paid. Thus ended the day at Ohrdruf. April 12, 1945. The liberation of Ohrdruf did more than shock the troops. It fundamentally altered Dwight D. Eisenhower. Usually, Eisenhower was a man of calculated restraint and calm. After walking through the gates of Ohrdruf, that calm vanished. He became a crusader. Why did he change so suddenly? It was the realization of a future lie. Eisenhower saw the piles of bodies and understood that one day, people would deny this reality. He knew skeptics would dismiss the evidence as mere wartime propaganda. Eisenhower acted immediately. He issued a direct command to every military unit in the sector: bring cameras, bring reporters, document every inch of the camp, film every body and every barracks. His orders were specific and blunt. He told his officers to get everything on record now. He stated that the day would come when some son of a bitch would claim this never happened. Thousands of American soldiers received the same order. Eisenhower forced them to tour the camp. He wanted the troops to see the victims with their own eyes. He wanted them to understand exactly why their comrades had died in the mud of Europe. Before this moment, many Gs viewed the conflict as a matter of maps and politics. After Ohrdruf, the perspective shifted. It became a war of good against evil. The change was documented in the ranks. One young soldier wrote in his diary that he would never feel sympathy for a German again. He wrote that they were no longer fighting a political enemy. They were fighting monsters. Ohrdruf was technically a small sub-camp. Buchenwald and Dachau were much larger. But Ohrdruf was the first. It was the moment the world woke up to the scale of the crimes. Patton's anger drove the process. He forced the local German civilians to march through the gates. The secrecy was gone. The common phrase, "we didn't know," was no longer a valid shield. Patton made sure they saw the truth. The American attitude toward Germany hardened instantly. The period of friendly occupation was over. The process of denazification began in the ruins of the camp. History often remembers Patton for his ivory-handled pistols and his aggressive speeches. Later in the war, some even accused him of being too soft on former Nazi officials. But at Ohrdruf, he was the one who exposed the horror most brutally. The footage shows the reality of that day. In April 1945, Patton was not acting as a general. He was a man facing pure evil. He did not look away. He grabbed the situation by the neck and forced the world to stare at it. The mayor of the town could not handle the sight. After the tour, he went home and ended his own life. But because of Patton and Eisenhower, the evidence remained. Events moved quickly. Today, the deniers Eisenhower feared still exist. His warnings remain relevant decades later. The record stands because they refused to let the crime be buried. This was the end of the first chapter of the liberation, but a new discovery waited in the dark. In a nearby salt mine, Patton was about to find Hitler's hidden billions. That story is next.